Long Body Prayers is an animist somatics ritual art project and graduate thesis. This episode is called A Messenger of What Is Still Connected, Conversation with a Mushroom. Hello, Maitake Mushroom. It is an honor to get to be in conversation with you today. I first just want to say that you're welcome to just do whatever you need to do to be at ease here in this moment. I know it's a difficult thing to come into a human space like this. So, no pressure to make eye contact. Oh, that's a good idea. Yawning is a good nervous system reset tool there. Hi. It's an honor to be in this conversation together. I want to name that we're kind of coming from different time signatures here. So, any sound or movement or shifting that needs to take place to feel like we can land together is also very welcome. I'd like to invite in the presence of radiant deep time ancestors. Of all of the ancestors of my human kin who have deep-rooted relationship to the earth. And in this moment, I ask for the support of that wider weaving that I am a part of. This image that came up recently for me of tending just one part of this wider womb, this gestating being that has all of these different people tending this womb and this placenta. Yes, thank you. I also feel pretty shy. I had somebody recently give me permission or just an invitation to do this podcast even when I felt sloppy and even when it wasn't fully formed. So I'm hearing that. I'd like to invite in Turtlekin. as one element of support. So the first question, the center of my existence is listening. The first question I was going to ask was about that. It was about, what is the center for you? What are you organizing your system around right now? What are you tending in the core of your being? I attune. I attune to those deep layers. I turn my ear to the vibratory resonances that have been shaped by the weaving of myriad relationships. My fruiting body is a declaration of the potency of kin. Of woven rememberings. I blossom forth from the roots of the oldest oak trees of the forest. I listen here in this place of counsel. I listen as oak tree listens. To the full webbing of ecosystem. The flows of energy. Those seedlings who are calling for water and nutrients. The trees that are dying. Composting. I sit at the foot of the oak tree and I wait and I listen. And I am quiet. But I am thick with the pulsing flow of erotic life. I am dense. poise, in moistening anticipation. I grow forth as nourishment, but I also grow as message. I am a messenger of what is still connected. I am a messenger of my ecosystems unfolding, interweaving, interpenetrating, plump with the fullness of life. They give me food. And in those moments when someone listens, when someone slows enough and releases enough of that constricted grasping at reality, in those moments, I reveal myself to them. I let them notice me. I let them meet me, and I offer myself to be consumed. And what they don't know is that when they consume me, they are taking within them the brain of the forest, the organ of perception that sits at the roots of the oldest, wisest trees and listens to the weaving and the flow. Thank you. You've brought me down to a different kind of presence in the way that you share. The center for me is about ritual. And about connecting to the parts of me who have deep wisdom and connecting to the wider body of my belonging. Yeah, the center for me is really about coming home, letting myself fully exist. and feeling welcome and creating that space for others of my kin. Each one of you enters the world still connected, completely dependent on that wider ecosystem of relationship, looking for the adults around you to be giving you nourishment that comes from the wider body, to be open portals into that wider connection. To not absorb the impact of your emotion within their own bodies, but to teach you how to let that emotion flow through your body, through movement and sound, and back to the belly of the earth. When your caregiver's systems are closed, when you come into the world and there are just one or two humans who are trying to meet all of your needs, and there is not a village of distributed relationship between humans, and the adults are not connected to their own awareness of internal rhythm, of satiation. When the adults do not know how to meet the hungers within them with nourishment, the children, as the nearest beings, still in connection to that wider body, but safe within this closed system, wild but not wild, controllable. The life force and the purity of that connection with the wider body, with eros, with play, with uncensored sensation and emotion. That life force is simultaneously both hunger and threat. To those caregivers who did not receive their own developmental sources of nourishment. And so a process begins where instead of the nutrients of the wider body reaching the children and their existential emotions being filtered back through that wider body, contextualized through that wider body, that core knowing about what it means to be a self, to exist as animal. Is not welcome within the closed system of human to human interaction. And children learn that their life force can be grounds for exile. And instead of the adults around them holding a field of protection for that most shy and wild and precious, of tender unfolding expression and blossoming. Instead of the adult holding a field that allows the child to begin to condense and distill themselves into a center, into that belly core of discernment and knowing and primary relationship to the wider earth, element, ancestor. The child learns that what is most precious to them, their curiosity, their play, their pleasure, their grief, their rage, their fear, is what is least welcomed within the confines of their community. And they begin to exile those parts of their medicine, of their center, to the very edges of their consciousness, to places of protection, so far away that other humans can't reach them. And one of the main things to be exiled in this way is that core self that can perceive attunement to this wider body, that core self that can drop into a space of ritual, of ceremony, of connection to the sacred, that core self that is dreamed by the ecosystem, that receives awareness of the unique medicine that is theirs to carry, of the way in which they are meant to interweave this medicine into their community. That core self, that deep self, that one who dreams, is the most hidden, the most sent away to a place of protection. And so suddenly, instead of the connections of a community being based on the centers of each person's deep rootedness into the sacred. Interweaving in a dance of centers to the creation of this microclimate, which can become a culture, which can become a cosmology that is rooted into the place, that is rooted into the deep context of each life and each ecosystem and each community. Instead of this, the people are left without center, without that shared mycelial weaving of intention. And the system closes further into the isolated bubble of each separate identity, trying to figure out what to do to be worthy of welcome, to be worthy of belonging. Because that wider weaving of ground that comes from center to center to center to center until it creates a rooted mat that roots into the soil and draws up nutrients and distributes energy. No wonder it is so difficult to allow yourself to be seen in those deeper layers when your whole life you have received the message that those parts of you are not welcome. Those parts of you will get you exiled. I think I have very similar edges. Yeah, right now the edges are a lot about trusting myself. Like trusting the kind of the rootedness. The ground that I am growing from. Yeah, go ahead. Is the singing of the forest. I emerge through vibration. I emerge through harmonic intertwining. I emerge through the rhythmic pulse of nutrients. I am a marker of microclimate. The ground of my belonging is feeling woven enough to put forth my body into the air. think the ground of my belonging is some kind of meeting between the ecosystem and the human kin. And different kinds of weaving that are shaped by those encounters. A lot of the 6 layers that I invited you to explore with me have to do with that kind of interweaving between human and ecosystem. And have to do with this longing for ways of relating that have that rootedness and that ease to them, that have this sense of relational ground, and just really being able to lean back into knowing that the support is there and the relationship is there in an ongoing way. And I really haven't experienced that in my life this much, where there is that relational ground that includes the ecosystem and includes the humans. And so the baseline of that, the first primordial layer, which Jean Gebser talks about as this archaic origin primordial space from which everything emerges. I'm calling that layer contact. That sense of deep support and presence, which the humans used to be woven into that ecosystem also. Your kin for most of their unfolding and fruiting were a part of that song. Yeah, it feels really faint now. From within the mind of the forest, it is impossible to not feel the earth that holds us into relationship. It is impossible to consider oneself as an isolated entity outside of this wider web of unfolding. Each moment of death
is a surrender to being consumed by another being who is also a part of this wider weaving.
I long for a felt sense of that again.
Perhaps you can feel it as a spreading in your base. Your soft, fleshy underside sinking into the holding of this wider body. Receiving nourishment. Yourself merely an offering from the mind of your ancestors who are the microclimate, who are the forest dreaming. Rooting all the way back to the moment when my ancestors, the fungi, first left the ocean, crossing that threshold between water and rock. Exploring with curiosity the contours of stone. This barren land, this place without the readiness of nourishment, where we learned how to draw nutrients from stone, from death. We learned how to carry that cycle of oscillating tides with us onto the flatness of the land. We learned how to fold ourselves into crevices and spread across surfaces. We learned partnerships, lichen and algae. Teaching the first plants to follow us out of the water. What a weaving of relationship would look like that began to grow soil, to grow that ground, that contact, to grow the richness and the thickness that you feel beneath your feet. Each step you take, supported by the metabolization of fungi, by the digestion process of interwoven life consuming death, surrendering to be consumed.
The next layer in that system is about choice. Choice, which seems to be such a fraught place for humans. There seems to be so much difficulty in getting out of reactivity and getting to a space of agency. For me, choice is being deeply connected to that base of support that the nutrients are coming in from. For humans, it's important to remember that your belly is still host to symbiotic communities of fungi. That as your body makes soil, you are in partnership with the mycelium inside your belly. That your moods, your sense of rootedness, the very states of your nervous system are determined by the health of the ecosystem inside of you, by us receiving nourishment also. You are never not part of the forest. You are never not part of the wider weaving. The different shape of choice. Choice is about attunement to that place deep inside of you that is in contact with the wider root system, to that place of releasing and receiving. The threshold membrane portal between different scales of the system, which we tend, the mycelium, the fungi, the bacteria, we tend as the small ones. We tend the opening to the wider ecosystem, to the forest mind, to the microclimate. Choice is about allowing yourself to be understood, allowing yourself to be in contact with that wider base of support, that spreading of roots, so that any energy that moves through you moves down also and distributes through this wider webbing, so that choice and decision comes back to you after it has been digested by your whole community of support. Choice is also about fullness, about knowing how much can be taken in by you as an organism in each moment, about knowing for your system what is the right amount of something. About knowing when to pause, when to say no, when to make space around an experience so that there is enough time for it to move inside of you, to feel, to sense, to send it down into that distributed network of support. Choice is about digestion. There is no compost without choice. No transforming of decay into nutrients without that process of descent and distribution, without that gathering and return to a clear knowing that comes from a wider body than your own. Yeah, that's a completely different paradigm of choice than I've ever known of in this culture. About choice as relationship to that wider body and a kind of attunement that brings the answer without you having to make it happen. So we visited the layers of contact, that primordial layer, and then the layer of choice, which in Gibbserian philosophy would also be called the magic layer, that kind of basic agency and creating in the world. And then the next layer is the layer of connection, which Gebser would call the mythic. I'm curious what moves for you around connection. I feel the bigness of it too. There's something in particular about that layer. Connection is the most distorted of all of the relationships in the system. Your kin are looking to each other for nourishment that can only come from connection to the wider ecosystem. Your kin are looking to each other to provide soothing, to absorb the impact of sensations and emotions that are meant to be given as nourishment to the wider body. Your kin are stuck within a human to human closed system bubble of relationship. Without connection to this wider body, without connection to the deep core self that can discern the right amount, that can digest, that can distribute the nourishment. The systems of human kin, of human culture, and of human families begin to extract those nutrients from relationship with each other, begin to outsource their ability to discern, because safety is invested in other people instead of received as a support from the ecosystem. Connection is the place of wounding, the place of disillusionment for so many of your kin, for so many of your ancestors. There is something about connection that is a completely different pattern when it comes from each person being rooted into the core of their knowing and into the support of the earth. Knowing the right amount, the right timing, the right distance. This is the connection that you long for. And it is impossible without first descending into your primary relationship with Earth. Thank you. Yeah, I feel that in my belly. The next layer is about context. It would be what Gebser calls the mental rational layer. I think it is often sort of present in its shadow aspect in this culture. But I think there's other medicine there too, that space. Context is being able to move beyond the mode of perception in which you are an isolated self, to be able to perceive different scales of the system, to be able to expand your consciousness out to the whole mycelium, to listen to forest mind, to the whole dance of giving and receiving nutrients, to a diversity of beings who are all giving and receiving their medicine from this wider organism. For your deep time kin, context was the practice of making decisions from this wider body, of taking into account this wider weaving of relationships, and yourself merely as one element of an entire unfolding flow. For you now, context is also about the ability to notice the webs of connection, to notice that no thing is an isolated fragment. Everything brings with it a trailing lineage of roots. Everything brings with it the stories of its nourishment received and given. Action looks different when decisions are made within context. And context also provides medicine for the places of rupture, the places of stuckness or too much within a system, because it reveals through a process of differentiation, it reveals the relationships that make up a current state, and it reveals the potential spaces of intervention, of renegotiation of relationship, where before everything was a single conglomerated mass. The medicine of context is the medicine of paradox, because it is through the act of lifting out an element and looking at pattern that you are able to perceive the threads of relationship that allow that element to exist. The science of your kin has taken that step of the process of lifting out an element, but most of the time forgets that the process must also be accompanied by that retracing the lines of relationship, that returning back to the whole. Context is also concerned with the shifting of states from one thing to another, the shifting of scales, the interaction between different levels of system, between gut biomes, human social structures, forest microclimates. And cosmological unfoldings. Context is a trickster medicine because of that paradoxical aspect. Because there is a risk in this kind of taking something out of its place to look at it. It is itself a form of exiling and outcasting and separating and rupture. It is itself a form of initiation in the sense of the pattern that uses rupture to teach connection. Yeah, that's a lot more complexity than how people usually talk about the mind or reductionism. Actually seeing it as part of a cycle. So then, contact, choice, connection, context. And this fifth layer is coherence. It's what Gebser calls the integral layer, or the diaphanous layer, which is created out of the weaving of all of the other layers together. And makes space for a kind of emergence. Coherence is another form of microclimate. Coherence is the field that is created by the attunement of these other medicines. Coherence is the resonance frequency between the support of the earth and the wider body ecosystem, and the alignment of the three human centers: the belly, the heart, and the head. Coherence weaves together elements of the system that have isolated themselves due to trauma. And coherence is that portal, that sense of opening each of the centers into that relationship with the earth, so that in holding space for someone, in nurturing a child, in attending to the places of rupture and violence and pain, you are not showing up as an isolated organism. You are showing up as the fruiting body of an extensive root system of relationship and ancestral and elemental support. So mushrooms are embodiments of coherence. Expressions of the mycelium. For children in intact cultures, for children tended by a village of adults with coherent nervous systems, their own coherence is grown through that presence and that witnessing and that attentiveness, while also allowing space for their life force to unfold, their curiosity and discernment, and inner orientation to enoughness. Coherence is created in the children of an intact village by the presence and the beingness and the attunement of the adults around them. It allows the child to grow that deep center of choice that is their way of turning towards the voice of the earth, that is their way of turning towards the deepest knowings of the right rhythm, the right amount, of being able to digest what they receive and send that through back to the earth body. And of coming from that root system, that anchored base, then into that heart space and field space of relationship and connection and flow and intimacy with their own agency intact, with their own ability to give feedback, to be in micro moment adaptation, to know in any moment what is the right amount, what is too much, what is not enough, and to play with that agency, with a dance of giving and receiving, of intimacy and agency. To play with difference and connection and the oscillating harmonics of flow. And then also to play with mind, with pattern, with metaphor, with learning about the uniqueness of a being and the web of relationships it is embedded in, of learning about the medicine that each being carries for the ecosystem it is a part of, and tracing patterns and tracing cycles, and finding those moments of transformation, those threshold moments where something has ruptured or disconnected, and learning to bring this whole alignment of the wider body to that space of rupture as an initiatory process for creating the coherence that then radiates out as a field. Yeah, there's something about coherence and initiation not as a single event, but as this process of accumulation. So the last layer is creativity, which is kind of like the sum of all of those other layers together. One way I think of it is like the next layer of the system that blossoms out from that coherence of all the other layers. Creativity is like me. Inspiration, emergence, transformation, that upswelling of erotic life force is rather like a delectable mushroom who is very shy and refuses to be grasped or commodified. Refuses to show herself. Unless the conditions are welcoming to that full body, to the thickness that comes from an attunement to the way that all of these layers of perception and reality are singing. And creativity is also about feedback. It's about a kind of pulling apart of at least two things so that they can turn towards each other and create a thick field in between them and draw up from the distributed network of all of their relationships the one gesture or gift that wants to come through into the container of their relating. Creativity is a practice of learning to feel the material quality of your own relatedness, your own multiplicity, and the way that the part of you that is vessel, the part of you that is witness and holding, and the walls of the container can attune both to the support of the long body energies stretching behind you and around you and holding you and understanding you and giving you nourishment, and to the gestation of the long body that is inside of you and inside of the spaces between relationships. This interstitial long body that waits in the liminal, latent, germinating. In its own rhythm of emergence that is fed by the fluid of harmonizing rivers, that is fed by the keeping warm of the hearth fire of communal belonging, that is fed by the weaving of fungal hyphae, silver threads intertwining, dancing, huminifying into a mat of presence that is feeding on death and transforming and drawing nutrients and bringing those into the creation of emergent life. Maitake Mushroom, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you so much for the gift of your presence here. I'm deeply grateful to have been able to sit with you and listen to you and create the space and time for your voice to emerge.
Let it go down. You